Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and today I'm going to do my September wrap-up. I'm really excited. This was one of my favorite months of reading just ever. It was really fun. I read 10 classics, which is my bread and butter. I read some fantasy. It was just really, really delightful. I read some fun intrigues. Like, I did not expect to read some of these books, and it was because of things I was watching or things I was listening to, and it was a whole exploration. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is Audition. It is by Kitamura, and if you're on the more literary part of BookTube, you probably heard about it because it is shortlisted for the Booker. I really liked this. It is very interesting because it is about a middle-aged woman who is in a New York restaurant, and she is in there with a man in his 20s. And the text is particularly obscure on purpose. We don't get to know their relationship. Even when it talks about race, for instance, it says, me and him are of the same race. It doesn't tell you what. And it's purposely obscure because we're not supposed to understand the relationship between them and all of those other things. And it's so brilliant and lovely and obscure. I love it. The second half is a total reversion. There's like a lot of different things happening, and I didn't like it as much, but I definitely liked it. I don't know if it's the ending I would have chosen, but I liked all of the things it played with. I would definitely reread it again just to like explore it, and it made me love writing. It made me want to write, and like I'm a person who definitely dabbles in writing a lot, and I love when books that I read give me inspiration to play with language and play with storytelling and play with all of those things. So I really liked that. I was going to save it till later because I read it later in the month, but I may as well just get rid of my other book from this list. I also finished Universality. I had originally DNF'd it in August, and then I decided to pick it up because I loved Audition so much that I was like, I should give this book another try. They both play with like different forms and stuff, and they play with mother relationships and all of those things. So I should definitely explore that book. And it was bad. I'm not sure if it was a bad book or I just didn't understand it. It's very, very mired in British politics and dialogue and all of those things. It talks about identity and gender and race and populism, but like a lot of the conversations are very British, so I'm not sure if I just can't understand it. It wasn't a book that I could find myself immersed in, and it was really sad because Assembly, her first novel, just blew me to pieces. Like, I thought it was fantastic. So I'm still excited for what Natasha Brown writes next, but Universality was not it for me. Now we're going to totally switch gears and we're going to go to my first classic, and this is Flush by Virginia Woolf. It is fantastic because this is a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog named Flush, who is a very, very noble Cocker Spaniel, and we kind of get the nobility and the legacy of his life. It is very great because she takes it very seriously and goes through like the narration of his species and his entry life from a cottage dog to that of this ill woman, and then we see this ill woman start to get letters. We see a man come, and she is a little bit jealous of Robert, who will become Elizabeth Barrett Browning's husband, and then also when she has a child that also affects things, and there is a lot of humanity given to this dog and to the experience, and it's an interesting biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning through the story of this dog who lived their life and followed them around. And I cried during this. I thought it was really beautiful. Like the feelings of Flush were just so there and present. It is very interesting for me as someone who has read a novel by her. I read To the Lighthouse. I read the short story Kew Gardens, which I thought was incredible, and read a couple pieces of her nonfiction, including A Room of One's Own. So it was very interesting to read this and to have such a different take, but I really, really liked it. Even if you don't think you're like it, like I don't like, dog stories or anything like that, but like this was a really good book and I think everyone should read it. I flirted with giving this 5 stars for a bunch of it because I was like, is it a 5-star book? And I think I landed at like a 4.5 star. Like I was like, it's epic. The next 2 books I'm going to talk about are conjoined, and this is Youth and Dependency, and these are book 2 and 3 in the trilogy, Childhood, Youth, and Dependency. And wow, the first book I really liked. I read it in August. The second book, I liked it as well, but it was an interesting story because Childhood really looks at childhood and talks about her growing up in 1930s Denmark and the Depression, poverty, and her wanting to be a female poet, her father being very educated but not thinking she can be a poet. And Youth takes place in her being 13. She has graduated from school. She is not to go to high school. She's not to finish any of her education. And it's interesting to see this one because she's not an adult. She's not independent. She has to live with her parents. However, she also has to make money. She also has to have a career. So it's one of those things where she's so dependent, but she's also working and feeding the family and doing all those things. And it's also looking at her having relationships with boys and relationships with her friends and how those dynamic. And like I wanted to read a line from this that I just thought like her writing throughout is just really beautiful. Like from the beginning of Childhood, I was like, wow, this writer writes. And it begins with, I always dream about meeting some mysterious person who will listen to me and understand me. I know from books that such a person exists, but you couldn't find that on my childhood street. And like, you see her dynamic. She's constantly looking for people who will publish her poetry, who will take her seriously. And then we get into dependency, which the word in Danish is gift. And that word both means marriage and poison, which fully describes the experience of dependency. Like, I can feel my face feeling with emotion. Like the tear glands are like working thinking about this book, because wow, this book was hard, especially after spending a lot of hours listening to her story through audiobook of this young girl from the time she's a little child and wanting these dreams and hopes and stuff. And then her going into adulthood, and we follow her publishing. She becomes a very creative and very popular young writer. She writes at magazines and stuff, and she would go on to be very successful throughout her life. And we follow her through a couple of marriages, and one of them unravels her entire life. And I guess it's spoilers, but the word dependency, I was so confused whenever I read the title of it, because I was like, childhood and youth and dependency, why like dependencies when you're younger? So I was really confused by that title, but it's talking about drug dependency. And one of her husbands is a doctor who gives her drugs, and she becomes dependent on it. And some of the most harrowing scenes I have ever read in my life are in this book. Like, I could not stop reading this book because I needed to know what happened. And I also was like devastated. It has a lot of marital assault in it. And like obviously wanting her to be dependent and control and all of those things. It is really, really difficult to listen to. Like, I read this pretty early in the month, and it's already a week into October, so it's probably been 3 weeks since I finished this book, and like I can still like envision scenes from this book. And it is, yeah, one of the most harrowing and most true examples of drug abuse I've ever heard. I wanted to read, this is the last line in the book, and the book takes place chronologically from 1941 to 1951, and it was published in 1971. So this is 20 years after the end of this book. I was rescued from my years of addiction, but ever since the shadow of the old longing still returns faintly. If I have a blood test or pass a pharmacy window, it will never completely disappear for as long as I live. I had a very similar response to reading this book as I did have reading The Bell Jar many, many years ago. And yeah, I've probably taken too much time talking about this book in a wrap-up, but wow, it really affected me as a book. Now, to completely change gears, I'm going to talk about The Summer I Turned Pretty. I had read the first book when I was, I don't know, 15, 16, somewhere in there. I didn't chronicle my books back then, so I think I was in mid-high school. And I liked it well enough. I had some issues, and then I started reading the second one, and I was like, absolutely not. And then years later, I started watching the show, and I flirted with the idea of like reading the books, and I never did until I was just waiting for the end of the series. And I was like, I'm gonna do it. So I read all 3 of them in like a week. It was very fun. The books are not that good, I would say. I am sorry about that, but I don't think that they are the best written books. I think that Jenny Han has improved a lot. Like, her writing and her character development has gone a lot, which makes sense. It's been 16 years since she first read these books. And yeah, I think it shows. But going on to a writer that I really love is Katabasis, and I'm going to pronounce this way because I looked it up. R.F. Kuang said it was originally how she pronounced it, and as someone who learned English later and pronounces words wrong, she hates when people are jerks about people mispronouncing things, and that is how it makes sense for me to spell this and pronounce it. So this is a book that I adore. I read Babel by her, and I adored it, and I've read Yellowface, and I thought that was an incredible book as well. This is an exploration of academia is hell, and I think it's perfect. I know that the reviews aren't 100% great for this, but I think it was fantastic. And I heard some people also say that like they thought that this was more cozy than horrific, and I would say, do you not read all the like the explorations of power in this book and the kind of haunting depictions of women in the workforce? Like, I thought that commentary was amazing. I think her commentary in general is really, really good. It is one of the things that I love about R.F. Kuang's writing. This is a book about 2 colleagues who have different understandings of each other, and they are both going to hell to rescue their professor who has died. It also looks at chronic illness in a way that I thought was really beautiful and empathetic. And yeah, I think that this representation and this book means a lot to me. Because I was reading this, I was also thinking about other fantasy books I would read, and I've been wanting to read Discworld. I think probably for 7 or 8 years. I have read Good Omens, which I liked but didn't love. And yeah, this book, Equal Rights, fantastic. It is the first in the Witches trilogy, many books. I think there's actually 5 of them. It is very funny. Terry Pratchett is a very, very funny man. And we follow kind of the 8th child of the 8th child is supposed to be the person who inherits magical wand and magical staff and being a wizard. And this man who is a wizard is about to die, and he goes to the house of a woman who is pregnant with her 8th child, and she has 7 sons, and he dies. And we have some scenes of death. And I know a lot about the Discworld world, so I've heard a lot about the beautiful writing of death, and I think that that was really beautiful. Like, death is a person in this story. Find out that the child that is born is actually a girl. She is a girl. So in this world, girls are witches and boys are wizards, and there's not the same thing. One of them, witches are more of the earth and more herbal and midwifery and all of those things, and wizards are more books and learning and those things. It is a book that was written in the late 80s, so we have a lot of conversation about gender and, you know, a girl can't be a wizard, and it is humorously explored. It is beautiful. I love Granny Weatherwax. I thought that was fantastic. Her banter, her development of various relationships, and I laughed a lot in the book. And I was so sad that The Weird Sisters has such a long hold on it. The next book I'm going to talk about is another classic fantasy. I have been reading through the Narnia series with my nephew, and this is A Horseless Boy. This has traditionally been my favorite Narnian book, and I still think it's up there. I was being read by my 9.5-year-old nephew at times, so at times I did not hear the story as clearly as one would want, but as a Christian, this book deals with Aslan and his relationship and the way that he shows up to us in various ways, and that has been emotional to me since I was a child, that he can be comforter, he can be corrector, he can be the person who protects you and is there in many ways, and you don't always see how God moves in your life, but he does. And yeah, it was emotional. It was lovely to read it with him, and I, as an older person now, can understand the racism that is in this book and the stereotype of Middle Eastern people that I do not approve of and do not like, but it's still a story that I have a lot of softness for. The next book I'm going to talk about is totally because I became obsessed with Epic the Musical this month. I need to read the Odyssey. And I looked up a few different narrations and stuff like that, and then I was like, I've always heard about Emily Wilson's version. And I started listening to the sample, and I did a rare thing, and I bought an audiobook. I don't think I've done that in like 6 years, but I did log on to my old thing being like, I'm not paying Audible anything, but I will see if I can get a free credit. And I did, and I started The Odyssey by Homer, translated by Emily Wilson, and I later got this from the library. So in audiobook, her introduction is 3 hours long. Can I tell you, that is like my favorite thing. I love exploring how texts are interpreted throughout ages, and this book does a brilliant job of doing that. And also why things have been translated as such. And also an interesting theme of the fact that translating something from ancient Greece to sound Victorian or Shakespearean is no more real than translating it in modern language, because, you know, they're still thousands of years apart. And yeah, she writes in a beautiful, very understandable tongue that works very well. And I'm just going to open to a random passage and read it, because I think that pretty much any line of her book is beautiful to be read. This food belongs to someone else, a man whose white bones may be lying in the rain or sunken beneath the waves. If they saw him return to Ithaca, they would all pray for faster feet instead of wealth and gold. Like, you can tell she's beautifully poetic. She talks about how she mimics the rhyming scheme and iambic pentameter of Shakespearean era, which I love, and you can hear the way, but with modern language, and I love it. The story itself, like, is one of the stories I know so much about that I feel like it can't create the same kind of wow for me in its original, but the language was beautiful. And I can't imagine reading this with no context and having all the story. I think that would be really epic. The next book I'm going to talk about is a book that isn't new absolute favorite. It is The Neighbours by Diane Oliver. And I think that I have been meaning to read this since it was released in its full version. This is by an author, Diane Oliver, who sadly died at the age of 22 in 1966. And I can't imagine what kind of writer she would be if she had lived a full life, or even like a partial life. Like, if she had died in her 50s, like, I imagine what kind of writer she would have been. It is set in the middle of the churn of the civil rights movement, and it's very interesting because even like when she talks about Martin Luther King and stuff like that, this is 2 years before he would die, and she never knows how the civil rights movement will will end up, but she's writing about it. And it begins with Neighbours, which is talking about the integration of a school, and only one boy has decided to integrate, or his family has decided to integrate him, and he is 6 years old. And yeah, it's heartbreaking. They're all worried about it, and you know, we find that discussion around that and the effects that have on the family and of the boy and all of those things. And then we go to a young woman who is working as a maid, but she is planning on going to university in the fall, and she wants to sit in on protest. She wants to go to all-white restaurants and sit in with the youth, and we watch her experience of doing that, even though her mother is telling her, don't do that. If you do that and you go to jail and you end up like a maid, you end up having no life, just like me. And it's talking about, what do you do? Do you risk? Do you live within the system in order to get educated, or do you protest now? And it has some horrific scenes of them in jail and the treatment of young activists in jail. It is, yeah, difficult to read. We see the effects of poverty on early motherhood and health. The health clinic is one of the 3 stories that were published within her lifetime. And it is a story about a mother and children and how hard it is to receive proper medical care. We have a story of a young activist going over to Europe and the way that she's exotified there. We have the story of a young white boy whose brother is going to go south to be in the protests, while his neighbor is from a long legacy of people who have been Confederates. And he is kind of caught between what his parents very much disapprove of his brother, but then also learning about the sympathies of this old lady who has decided to give money to the boy who's gone to protest. It's an interesting story. And the other story that follows a white protagonist is one of a woman who is a divorced woman who has a young son. She falls in love with a doctor who is black, but light enough in order to pass. And her story when they are together but not together for 7 years, and then after they marry, and that experience and the experience of that family. And yeah, these stories, all of them, there's several more as well, are just so evocatively, like, she's such a varied writer. Like, some of them are her writing about, you know, older people and stuff like that, where there's like, she died at 22. She did not know about these experiences, but she writes of so many of them. And I cannot imagine what kind of writer she would have been if she had lived of an age. And her delicacy and evocativeness and straightforwardness and the way that she is able to render characters, they are all really beautiful. Not all of these stories were 5 stars, but the collection were like full across 5 stars, because so many of these stories are knocked out of the park amazing. And I will continue to think about them, and I wish I had more to read of her. The next foray into short stories came from this. I was reading this and I was like, I need to read more short stories. I was looking at them, and then I kept on being reminded of the fact that the excellent short story prize is named after O. Henry, who wrote a lot of short stories in his life. I have never read his books. Like, I think I might have read The Gift of the Magi, but like, that is such a popular story. I'm not sure if I've read it or just heard it. And yeah, I found that collection. There was like 6 or 7 of his stories that were an audiobook through my library, and I read that. It included The Gift of Magi as well as A Redemption Retrieved, which was my favorite of the books, but they were not my favorite. Some of them were humorous, some of them were not so. I don't think any of them had lasting effects on me, but it is a collection of short stories that I read. Sometime this summer I was nannying and I watched Winnie the Pooh, and I thought about, these are really great stories, I should read his writing. And I did. I discovered which book was his first. It is not the first in the chronology, but it was his first appearance of Winnie the Pooh in a very strange way. And this is called When We Were Very Young by A. Milne. And from the introduction, I was sold. He literally begins talking about how he thought about giving a little example and explanation of each poem like Mr. Wordsworth does. And he was like, yeah, but then I decided not to do that. And then I thought about, you know, not all of these poems go together, but like if I was to take one out, then I'd have to take the next one out, and then I'd have no collection at all. And he gives inspiration to Christopher Robin, not mentioning that Christopher Robin is his son, but he also gives, you know, inspiration and thankfulness to the person who illustrated it. And it's just like a very funny writing. And this is like a love letter to childhood, to wonder, to whimsy, to humor. It is fantastic. It is very interesting because Winnie the Pooh in this short collection is a swan. And then there's also a story of a bear that would go on to be Winnie the Pooh. And I started recently the Winnie the Pooh, the first one, and he talks about that in the introduction, where he decided to rename the swan and use it for the bear because that felt better. But yeah, these are some great, delightful stories, and I feel like I would definitely read them to my kids if I had some young ones to read to. So the next series of books are all connected, and it's because I wanted to do a video. Am I going to do this video? I don't know, I've not been feeling the best, but I was thinking about Pygmalion and the depictions of them throughout. So I went back to Ovid and I read the Pygmalion story about Pygmalion and his statue, and that is interesting. And then I read George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, and that it's different than I remember. I read it, I think, 8 years ago. And at the time I liked it, probably a year or so before I'd watched My Fair Lady, and I definitely took more of that information in than Pygmalion, who ends quite sadly. Like, I did not remember the bittersweetness of it, and Higgins and Eliza's relationship being quite fraught. And I felt this like hollowness in my chest at the way that Higgins treats her at the end, and it makes me deeply sad that in My Fair Lady it's a happy ending. I hope that I'm not spoiling this for everyone else because I'm going to spoil it. But yes, it ends with her being like, you don't listen to me and you don't respect me as a person, and her leaving it him being like, no, she's going to continue on doing the chores and groceries and stuff because I know she'll come back to me, which is, wow, devastating and works with the Pygmalion story. And then I continued from that and I read Galatea again. And this is a book that I really loved. I read it close to 2 years ago now by Madeline Miller, and she is the epic writer of both Circe and Song of Achilles. And I remember like the hauntingness in my chest, and it was so interesting that I read both of these books and I had the same experience, Galatea more so, but I wanted to read this quote. So the story of Pygmalion, I guess I didn't explain it, is the story of a man who is a sculptor who makes the statue of a woman and then she comes alive and he's in love with her. And the story by Galatea takes that to its logical conclusion and talks about this man who made this perfect woman and exotified her and made her pure, but because of that, he wanted to own her. And what does that look like? And it's interesting. The Yellow Wallpaper is one of my favorite books of all time and explores the thing, and I think that she took inspiration from that as well. And she talks about, actually, Madeline Miller in her introduction talks about how she took more inspiration from feminist literature than she did from the myth itself. The thing is, I don't think my husband expected me to be able to talk. I don't blame him for this exactly, since he had known me only as a statue, pure, beautiful, and yielding to his art. Naturally, when he wished me to live, that's what he wanted me still, only warm so that he could blank me. What an effective exploration of that. It's interesting. I thought, going back to Pygmalion, that it would have a softer explanation of that, and like you would see kind of the ways of how feminism has explored things over time, and we would get a more critical view. But I think that Pygmalion also has a really critical view of Higgins as well, and My Fair Lady chooses to make it more romantic. The last book I'm going to talk about is a complete surprise. A week ago today, like on September 29th or something, I was at a thrift store just after driving my friend to a doctor's appointment. I wasn't even planning on going, but I was like, let's go through and let's look at the books. And I saw this title and I was like, oh my goodness, Italian Women and Other Tragedies. And then I opened the first page and I read the first poem. It is called Italian Women. These are the women who were born to give birth. They breathe only leftover air and speak only when deeper voices have fallen asleep. I have seen them bleed into the dark, hiding the stains inside them, like sins, apologizing. I have seen them wrap their souls around their children and serve their own hearts in a meal they never share. And I was like, okay, I'm buying this book for $2. I'm definitely doing that. And this collection, which is written by a Canadian author, her name is Gianna Patriarca. I'm bad at Italian names. She's written some other books that I hope I can get a copy of, because I don't think this book is in print today, as there is 16 ratings on Goodreads and 3 reviews. It is not a popular book, but I think it should be. Like, the way that it looks at so many things, it looks at power and leaving a land behind and the loneliness and the distance between a father and a daughter and teaching and being a parent and love and abuse and domestic abuse. And she never shies away from depicting some pretty awful stuff. Like, there are some explorations of abuse that are very violent, but they don't feel gratuitous. They feel honest and real. And there is one about a woman who seems to be mad based on her bizarre actions, and then it goes inside the house and explains the abuse that she's going under. Gianna was a teacher throughout her career in Toronto, and she talks about all of these children that she loves and the way that, their skin crawls away from people and shudders, and she talks about some of the abuse that they went under. Like, it is a very strong reckoning with power and abuse, but also love. The last poem is about putting her daughter to sleep and the love there. And yeah, she never shies away from both passion and confronting. And I think it is one of the best books I have ever read, and I hope more people read it, because if you can get a copy of this book, please read it. It is a really extraordinary book. It was published in 1994, so I would consider it a modern classic. It is, 31 years old. And yeah, I really hope I can read more of her books and get a copy of them, because I think it's an author that deserves to be read and celebrated and, enjoyed and listened to. Those are the 17 books that I read in September. I think I had a really, really extraordinary reading month. There are so many books that I really, really loved, from Audition to Flush to Dependency to Equal Rites and Katabasis and Neighbours and Galatea and Italian Women and Other Tragedies. Like, there were so many books that I so loved, and so many books that were like also really good. Like, other than Universality and O. Henry's short stories, like, I don't think there was any books that I was like, that was terrible, you know? And yeah, what a great reading month. I would love to hear your thoughts on any books you read or any books that I might have piqued your interest in. And yeah, please comment. I know comments are not always very common, and I will say, as a personal thing, if you got in this far into the video, I'm hoping that you're a person who enjoys my content. But yeah, like, I often see likes on videos, but sometimes I never get comments, which I know comments can take time. But I will say that even like a word or a couple words of your thoughts like really actually impact me. And sometimes it's very sad for me to make videos this long and then feel like I'm speaking to a void. So if you are here, it would make me incredibly happy to hear a thought, whatever thought you have about this video or about anything in here. I would love to hear it, and I will see you next time.